In the final winter of World War II, deep inside a frozen German airfield, a captured P-51 Mustang lay twisted in the snow, its silver skin torn, its engine still warm. When a team of German Luftwaffe engineers arrived to study it, they expected a mere American toy. But as they peeled back its panels, they found something that shook their pride to the core: precision, power, and genius beyond their reach. One whispered, "We've lost the sky." And for the first time, even the most loyal officers knew victory would never again come from above. The wind howled across the abandoned airfield near Cottbus, 70 kilometers southeast of Berlin. It was January 1945, and the war had stripped the land bare. Snow covered the cratered runway like a shroud over a dying empire. In the distance, the rumble of Soviet artillery grew louder each day, a drumbeat counting down the hours of the Third Reich. Dr. Karl Eisen stood beside the transport truck, his breath crystallizing in the frigid air. At 47, he was one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced aeronautical engineers, a man who had designed components for the Me-262 jet fighter and consulted on the FW-190's engine cooling systems. His wire-rimmed glasses were perpetually fogged in this weather, and his wool coat, once pristine, was now patched at the elbows. The war had reduced everyone to scarcity. Beside him stood Captain Hans Müller, a veteran fighter pilot whose face bore the map of 100 sorties. At 32, Hans had shot down 18 Allied aircraft, but his eyes held no pride anymore, only exhaustion and something deeper. Something like recognition of futility. His left hand bore scars from a cockpit fire the previous summer, burns that still ached in the cold. The third man was Lieutenant Franz Weber, barely 24, an administrative officer from the Reich Air Ministry, sent to observe and report. Franz represented the party's eyes, though Karl suspected the young man's faith was beginning to crack like ice on a warming pond. His uniform was immaculate compared to theirs, his boots polished to a mirror shine that seemed obscene amid such desolation. The object of their journey sat 200 meters away, half buried in snow at the edge of the tree line. The downed American fighter had crash-landed 3 days prior, its pilot captured alive, a rarity that suggested either mechanical failure or fuel starvation rather than combat damage. The Mustang's silver fuselage caught what little sunlight penetrated the overcast sky, looking almost pristine despite the violence of its landing. "They're building thousands of these," Hans said quietly, breaking the silence. "Thousands. And we can barely keep 200 operational fighters in the air." Karl nodded but said nothing. The mathematics of attrition had become impossible to ignore. Every report that crossed his desk told the same story. American industrial capacity was beyond comprehension. For every German aircraft destroyed, the Allies produced 10 more. For every German pilot killed, the Americans trained 20 replacements. Franz adjusted his cap, trying to project authority. "The Führer has ordered complete analysis of all captured enemy equipment. This aircraft represents an intelligence opportunity of the highest priority. It represents more than that," Karl said softly, more to himself than the others. They trudged through the snow toward the aircraft, their breath trailing behind them like ghosts. A crew of 6 mechanics waited beside the Mustang, having spent 2 days carefully extracting it from the snowdrift without causing additional damage. The aircraft's propeller was bent, 2 blades curled backward like flower petals, but the fuselage appeared largely intact. Karl approached slowly, his engineer's eye taking in every detail. The P-51D's lines were elegant, in a way that German aircraft were not. Where the Messerschmitt Bf 109 was angular and aggressive, where the Focke-Wulf 190 was brutish and powerful, the Mustang seemed to flow. Its teardrop canopy offered visibility that German pilots could only dream of. The laminar flow wing design was revolutionary, minimizing drag in ways that Karl had only theorized about in technical journals before the war. He placed his gloved hand on the aluminum skin. Even through the leather, he could feel the quality of the construction. This was no hastily assembled war machine. Despite being mass-produced, despite rolling off assembly lines at a rate of 1 aircraft every hour, the craftsmanship was impeccable. How is this possible? Hans asked, voicing Karl's own thoughts. How can they build so many and build them this well? Karl peered through the shattered canopy into the cockpit. Blood stained the pilot's seat. The American had survived, but not unscathed. Personal effects were scattered. A photograph of a young woman holding a child, a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, a leather-bound New Testament. Reminders that the enemy was human, that he loved and was loved, that he carried the same hopes and fears as any German pilot. Franz began taking notes in his leather journal, documenting serial numbers and markings. P-51D-15NA. He read from the data plate. Manufactured by North American Aviation, Inglewood, California. Serial number 44-15476. California. Karl repeated. He had never been to America, but he had studied at universities with American engineers before the war. He remembered their optimism, their belief in progress and possibility. He had dismissed it then as naive. Now, standing before this machine, he wondered if perhaps they had understood something fundamental that Germany had not. The mechanics had rigged a canvas shelter over the aircraft to protect it from further snow. Inside this makeshift hangar, they began the systematic disassembly. Karl directed them to remove panels carefully, preserving every component for study. Franz photographed each step with a Leica camera, the shutter clicking rhythmically in the cold air. As they worked, Hans circled the aircraft, studying it from every angle. His pilot's instinct was reading the machine in a different language than Karl's engineering expertise. The fuel tanks, he said, running his hand along the fuselage behind the cockpit. They're enormous. This thing could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. That was the terrible truth that had changed everything. Before the Mustang, Allied bombers had been vulnerable during deep penetration raids into Germany. The Luftwaffe's fighters had torn into them mercilessly, forcing the Americans to accept horrific losses. But then came the P-51 with its Merlin engine and massive fuel capacity, capable of flying from England to Berlin and engaging in dogfights for the entire journey. The balance of power in the sky had shifted irrevocably. Karl supervised the removal of the engine cowling, revealing the Packard V 1650 Merlin engine beneath. Even in the dim light of the canvas shelter, the engine gleamed. He leaned closer, examining the cylinder arrangement, the supercharger housing, the intricate plumbing of the cooling system. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "let us see what America really builds." They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, setting up arc lights powered by a portable generator. The temperature inside the canvas shelter rose slightly, though their breath still clouded the air. Karl methodically examined each component as it was removed, taking measurements, making sketches, dictating observations to Franz, who transcribed everything in precise script. The aluminum skin of the P-51 was the first revelation. Karl measured its thickness with calipers, remarkably thin. Yet the alloy composition was superior to anything Germany currently produced. He scraped a small sample for metallurgical analysis, noting how the material bent without cracking, how it maintained structural integrity despite minimal thickness. "This is 24ST aluminum alloy," he told Hans, who was watching over his shoulder. "We've been trying to develop something similar for 2 years. They're using it as standard production material." Hans frowned. "How?" "Our metallurgists are the best in the world." "We're the best," Karl corrected gently. "Before we lost access to bauxite mines in Hungary, before our refineries were bombed into rubble, before our best chemists fled to Switzerland or were conscripted into infantry units because some party official decided scientific expertise was less important than ideological purity." Franz looked up sharply from his notes. Such talk bordered on defeatism, possibly even treason. But he said nothing. What could he say? The evidence was here, cold and tangible, impossible to deny. They removed the wing panels next, exposing the internal structure. The construction was a masterpiece of engineering efficiency. Where German aircraft used complex multi-spar designs requiring skilled craftsmen to assemble, the Mustang's wing employed a simpler 2-spar configuration that could be built quickly without sacrificing strength. Karl ran his fingers along the ribs and stringers. "Look at this," he said. "Every component is designed for mass production. The tolerances are maintained not through individual craftsmanship, but through precision tooling. They've created a system where less skilled workers can produce consistent quality." It was a philosophical difference that cut to the heart of why Germany was losing the war. German engineering tradition valued the master craftsman, the expert who could hand-fit components to perfection. German aircraft were often superior in raw performance because skilled workers could optimize each individual machine during assembly. But that approach didn't scale. It required years to train master craftsmen. It resulted in aircraft that varied in quality depending on who built them. And when those craftsmen were killed in bombing raids or sent to the Eastern Front, the knowledge died with them. America had chosen a different path. They had invested in tools, in jigs and fixtures, in standardized processes. They had embraced the assembly line philosophy of Henry Ford and applied it to aircraft production. The result was not individual excellence, but collective reliability and overwhelming numbers. Hans sat down on a wooden crate, suddenly looking exhausted. "We were proud," he said quietly. "The Luftwaffe was invincible. Our fighters were faster. Our pilots better trained. We had aces with hundreds of kills. And then," he gestured at the Mustang, "then they simply built more planes than we could shoot down. And their pilots didn't need to be aces. They just needed to be competent and numerous." Karl removed his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief, though they immediately fogged again when he replaced them. "It's not just about numbers," he said. "It's about infrastructure, about an industrial base that can innovate and produce simultaneously. Look at this engine." They had fully exposed the Packard V1000, 650 Merlin now, and Karl began his examination. The engine was a licensed copy of the British Rolls-Royce Merlin, but manufactured in America with modifications that improved reliability and eased production. The cylinder blocks were cast as single pieces, reducing assembly time. The supercharger was elegantly integrated, providing excellent high-altitude performance. "This engine produces 1,400 horsepower reliably," Karl said, taking measurements of the cylinder bore. "Our Daimler-Benz DB 605 inches, the BF 109, produces the same power, but only when pushed to its limits. It requires constant maintenance, and it fails frequently. This engine," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "this engine is designed to be dependable rather than exceptional, and in warfare, dependability wins." Franz was writing frantically, trying to capture every technical detail. "The ministry will want to know if we can replicate this," he said. Karl laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Replicate it? Lieutenant, we lack the aluminum alloys, the precision tooling, the electrical components, even the fuel quality required to operate engines like this. We're using ersatz materials and synthetic fuel that degrades engine performance. Our factories are operating with forced laborers who have no investment in quality. Even if we had the complete blueprints, we couldn't build this aircraft." "Then what are we doing here?" Franz asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "We're learning," Karl said simply. "We're understanding. And perhaps, if any of us survive this war, we're preparing for what comes after." Outside the canvas shelter, the generator sputtered and coughed. The lights flickered. One of the mechanics went to refuel it, pouring in precious gasoline from a jerry can. Even fuel had become scarce. Hans stood and walked to the Mustang's tail section, examining the radio equipment. "They have radar-ranging gun sights," he said, his voice tight. "Gyroscopic aiming systems. We're still using ring and bead sights that haven't changed since the last war." "Not just technology," Karl said, joining him. "Infrastructure. Training. Logistics. The Americans arrive over Germany in formations of hundreds of bombers, each one protected by fighters like this. They lose aircraft, yes, but they have the industrial capacity to replace them overnight. They lose pilots, but they have training schools producing thousands more. It's not warfare anymore. It's mathematics." Franz closed his notebook. "The Führer says our will is stronger. That German spirit will overcome material disadvantage." Karl and Hans exchanged glances. There was nothing to say to that. Will didn't defeat physics. Spirit didn't manufacture ball bearings or refine aviation fuel. The Nazi ideology had celebrated heroism and sacrifice, but it had systematically destroyed the intellectual and industrial infrastructure needed to sustain modern warfare. They worked through the night, documenting everything. Karl sketched the fuel system, noting the self-sealing tanks that prevented fires when punctured, another innovation Germany had been slow to adopt. He examined the hydraulic systems, the electrical wiring, the ammunition feeds. Every component told the same story. Thoughtful design, quality materials, systematic production. As dawn approached, casting gray light through the canvas, Karl stood back and surveyed their work. The Mustang lay partially disassembled, its secrets exposed but not fully comprehensible. It was one thing to see how something was built. It was another to understand the entire ecosystem, the factories, the supply chains, the educational systems, the research infrastructure that made such construction possible. We should rest, Hans said. Continue tomorrow. But Karl shook his head. Time is our enemy now, Captain. The Soviets advance daily. This facility may be overrun within weeks. We must learn what we can while we can. Franz had fallen asleep, sitting upright, his notebook clutched to his chest. Karl gently removed it, glancing at the meticulous notes. The young man had documented everything faithfully, but Karl wondered if he truly understood what these observations meant. This wasn't just an aircraft. It was a mirror reflecting Germany's failures. Every superior component was evidence of a system that Germany had rejected: openness to innovation, investment in mass education, industrial practices that valued efficiency over tradition, a society that could mobilize its entire economy without enslaving half of Europe. Karl looked at the P-51's cockpit, at the blood-stained seat where the American pilot had fought to control his dying aircraft. That pilot was probably now in a POW camp, waiting for the war to end, confident that his nation would prevail. And he was right to be confident. His nation had built a machine that was better in almost every measurable way than what Germany could produce. The question that haunted Karl as the sun rose over the frozen airfield was simple and terrible. How had they not seen this coming? How had Germany, with its proud scientific tradition and engineering excellence, fallen so far behind? The answer, he suspected, lay not in technical failures but in philosophical ones. Germany had embraced an ideology that valued racial purity over merit, that drove away its best minds, that subordinated science to politics. America, for all its flaws, had remained open, pragmatic, willing to learn from anyone regardless of origin. The sky was brightening now, and in the distance, Karl could hear the drone of aircraft engines. Allied bombers on another daylight raid, secure in the knowledge that fighters like this Mustang would protect them all the way to their targets and back. The sky belongs to them now, Hans said quietly, standing beside him. Karl nodded. Yes, and perhaps it always should have. On the third day of their examination, Karl finally removed the engine's cylinder head, exposing the valve train and combustion chambers. What he found inside made him sit back on his heels in silent admiration. The precision was extraordinary. The tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch, maintained consistently across every cylinder. The valve seats showed almost no wear, despite what must have been hundreds of hours of operation. The piston crowns were clean, indicating optimal fuel combustion and excellent mixture control. This engine is a work of art, Karl said, running his finger along the perfectly smooth cylinder wall. But it's art that can be mass-produced. That's the genius of it. He called over one of his assistants, a young mechanic named Paul Richter, who had worked in the BMW aircraft engine factory before being conscripted. Paul had the hands of a craftsman, despite being only 19. Tell me what you see, Karl instructed. Paul examined the engine carefully, professionally. The supercharger is two-stage, two-speed. That gives excellent performance at both low and high altitudes. The intercooler system is more efficient than our designs. And this, he pointed to the coolant passages. The cooling system is engineered to maintain optimal temperatures under sustained high-power operation. Our engines overheat after 15 minutes of combat power. This one could probably run at full throttle for hours. Correct, Karl said. And do you know why? Paul consider. Better materials, superior design, both, yes. But also philosophy. Look at how accessible everything is. This engine was designed to be maintained by average mechanics in field conditions. German engines require specialists. We design for the expert. They design for the common soldier. It was a bitter pill to swallow. German engineering had always prided itself on sophistication, on pushing the boundaries of what was possible. But in doing so, they had created machines that were temperamental, difficult to maintain, and impossible to keep operational without extensive support infrastructure. The Merlin engine, by contrast, was engineered for war. It was robust, reliable, and forgiving of minor maintenance errors. A crew chief with basic training could keep it running. A well-supplied unit could maintain high operational readiness rates. Hans had been studying the engine logbook they had recovered from the aircraft. According to this, the pilot had 137 flight hours on this particular engine. No major maintenance issues, just routine oil changes and inspections. Karl did some quick mental arithmetic. That's nearly double the service life of our DB-605 between overhauls. And this engine was still running when the aircraft crashed. Franz joined them, having been outside taking photographs of the airfield for his report. His cheeks were red from the cold, but his eyes were troubled. I spoke with the facility commander. Soviet forces have crossed the Oder River. We have perhaps 2 weeks before this position becomes untenable. Then we work faster, Karl said. Over the next several days, they conducted dynamic tests. Using the facility's remaining fuel stocks, they mounted the engine on a test stand and attempted to start it. The electrical system was damaged, but Paul managed to repair it using salvaged components. When the engine finally fired, the sound filled the hangar like thunder. The Merlin's distinctive rumble was different from German engines, deeper, more resonant, somehow more confident. Karl stood beside the test stand, feeling the vibrations through his boots, watching the instruments as Paul gradually advanced the throttle. The engine responded smoothly, without the characteristic roughness of German power plants. The supercharger engaged seamlessly. The temperatures and pressures remained within optimal ranges. Paul ran it through a series of power settings, from idle to combat power, and the engine performed flawlessly. Hans stood transfixed, his scarred hands gripping the hangar railing. Tears tracked down his face, and he made no effort to hide them. "If I had this," he said, his voice breaking. "If our fighters had this, so many of my friends would still be alive." Karl shut down the engine, and silence returned. But the memory of that sound remained, a ghost in the air. It was the sound of American industrial might, the mechanical heartbeat of a nation that had mobilized its entire economy for victory. "Write that in your report," Hans said to Franz, his voice hardening. "Write that we lost the war not because our pilots lacked courage, not because our tactics were inferior, but because we were outproduced and out-engineered by a nation we called mongrel and inferior." Franz's pen hesitated over the paper. To write such things was dangerous, potentially treasonous, but could anyone deny it? The evidence was here, tangible and undeniable. Karl began his formal technical report that evening, working by lamplight in the facility's administrative office. He chose his words carefully, knowing that multiple eyes would read this document, some looking for technical intelligence, others looking for signs of defeatism or sedition. He described the aluminum alloys, the engine design, the aerodynamic innovations. He provided measurements, calculations, comparative analyses. But he also included observations that went beyond mere technical description. The P-51 Mustang represents not just an advanced aircraft design, but an advanced industrial philosophy. Its construction reveals a systematic approach to manufacturing that achieves both quality and quantity objectives, previously considered mutually exclusive. The implications extend beyond aviation to all aspects of modern warfare. Germany's traditional emphasis on craftsmanship and individual excellence, while producing superior individual specimens, cannot compete with an industrial system that produces adequate specimens in overwhelming numbers. He paused, considering his next words. Then he continued. Recommendation. Post-war German aviation industry must study and adopt American production methodologies. The future belongs not to the master craftsman working in isolation, but to the team of competent engineers and workers supported by advanced tooling and systematic processes. It was as close as he dared come to writing what he truly thought, that Germany had lost not just a war but a historical moment, that the future belonged to nations that could balance innovation with production, quality with quantity, excellence with accessibility. Franz read over his shoulder. The ministry may not appreciate such candor. The ministry, Karl said dryly, is about to become irrelevant. If we're fortunate, the Soviets will shoot us quickly. If we're unfortunate. He didn't finish the sentence. Hans entered the office, carrying a bottle of schnapps liberated from somewhere. Gentlemen, I propose a toast. He poured 3 glasses. To the P-51 Mustang, the machine that taught us humility. They drank in silence, the alcohol burning in their throats. Outside, the sound of distant artillery continued its monotonous rhythm, growing louder each night. The Red Army was coming, and with it, the end of everything they had known. But here, in this frozen hangar, surrounded by the components of an American fighter aircraft, Karl felt something unexpected. Not despair, but a strange kind of peace. He had spent his career designing machines of war, contributing to Germany's aerial dominance. Now, examining the work of his counterparts across the ocean, he realized that engineering transcended nationalism. The men who designed this aircraft, American engineers he would never meet, had solved problems he was still struggling with. They had created something beautiful in its efficiency, elegant in its practicality. In another world, one not divided by war and ideology, they might have been colleagues, collaborating rather than competing. What will happen to your research? Hans asked, as if reading his thoughts. Karl looked at his notes, at the technical drawings and measurements that filled dozens of pages. I'll try to preserve it, send copies through different channels, hope that someone, somewhere, will learn from it. And if the party finds out you're documenting German deficiencies? Karl smiled grimly. Then I suppose my fate will be the same regardless of whether the Soviets or the SS find me first. Franz closed his notebook. I'll include your technical findings in my report, but modify some of the conclusions. For your protection, it was a small act of rebellion, a tiny crack in the facade of absolute obedience. Karl nodded his thanks. They returned to the hangar, where the partially disassembled Mustang waited in the darkness. Karl ran his hand along its wing one more time, feeling the cold metal under his palm. You were right, he said to Hans. We've lost the sky, but perhaps we can learn from those who won it. The 4th day brought unexpected visitors. A staff car arrived from Berlin bearing 2 Gestapo officers and a civilian technical consultant from the Reich Air Ministry. Their presence immediately altered the atmosphere, introducing suspicion and fear into what had been, despite everything, a collegial investigation. The senior Gestapo officer, Sturmbannführer Heinrich Kraus, was a thin man with the hungry look of a predator. He examined Franz's credentials first, then Karl's, his cold eyes searching for any hint of irregularity. Your report will be forwarded directly to Reichsmarschall Göring, Kraus announced. Any defeatist commentary will be noted and acted upon accordingly. Karl kept his expression neutral. We are scientists, Sturmbannführer. We report what we observe. Science serves the Reich. Observation must align with ideological truth. It was absurd demanding that physical reality conform to political doctrine, but Karl had learned long ago not to argue with men like Kraus. Such men measured loyalty by enthusiasm rather than competence, and they had the power to destroy careers, lives, families. The civilian consultant, Dr. Wilhelm Brandt, was more reasonable. He was perhaps 50, with the distracted air of an academic thrust unwillingly into practical matters. He examined the Mustang with genuine scientific interest, asking intelligent questions about the engine design and manufacturing processes. The supercharger design is fascinating, Brandt said, studying Karl's sketches. We've attempted similar configurations but struggled with reliability. How have they solved the intercooling problem? Karl explained the Mustang's system, warming to the topic despite the oppressive presence of the Gestapo officers. For a brief moment, it felt like a normal technical discussion between colleagues, but Krauss interrupted. What matters is not how they solved problems, but whether we can exploit this intelligence to improve our own aircraft. With respect, Karl said carefully, improving our aircraft requires more than intelligence. It requires materials we no longer have reliable access to, factories that are being bombed daily, and time we do not possess. Defeatist talk, Krauss snapped. Realistic assessment, Karl countered. You ask for technical analysis. The technical reality is that American industrial capacity exceeds ours by a factor of 10 or more. This aircraft is evidence of that capacity. Franz intervened smoothly, diffusing the tension. Dr. Eisen's observations are purely factual, intended to provide context for Germany's strategic response. His loyalty is unquestionable. Krauss studied Karl for a long moment, then nodded curtly. But Karl knew he had made an enemy. Such men kept lists, and they had long memories. That evening, after the visitors had departed, Hans found Karl smoking outside the hangar, a rare indulgence, as tobacco had become precious. You should be more careful, Hans said. Men like Krauss are looking for excuses to demonstrate their zealotry. The war is lost, so they hunt for internal enemies to explain the failure. I'm too old to be afraid, Karl said, though it wasn't entirely true. He thought of his wife Margarethe and their daughter Anna, both in Hamburg, living under constant bombardment. Fear was his constant companion now, but it had evolved from fear of death to something more complex, fear of dying without meaning, of having wasted his talents in service of evil. The American pilot, Hans said suddenly. The one who flew this aircraft. I spoke with him yesterday. Karl turned, surprised. Where? The POW holding facility. 30 kilometers east. I pulled rank to get access. I wanted to understand, to see the face of the men who defeated us. And Hans was quiet for a moment. He was 23 years old, a lieutenant from a place called Michigan. College educated, trained for 9 months before his first combat mission. He had flown 42 missions, escorted bombers to Munich, Berlin, Frankfurt. He said he was fighting for freedom, for democracy, for his future children who would grow up in a world without tyrants. Propaganda, perhaps. Or perhaps he actually believed it. And perhaps that belief is what gave him the will to fly mission after mission into hostile skies. Karl considered this. What did you tell him? I told him his aircraft was magnificent. That if I had flown such a machine, I might still have faith in victory. He said the machine didn't matter as much as the cause, that the Mustang was just a tool, and tools could be manufactured. But justice and freedom, those were worth dying for. Naive. Is it? He's going home after this war, Karl. Back to Michigan, to whatever life awaits him there. While we... Hans gestured at the devastated landscape around them. What awaits us? Soviet occupation, war crimes, trials, re-education camps? It was a question without good answers. Karl had served the Reich faithfully, designing aircraft that had killed thousands. That he had done so as a patriotic duty, that he had opposed Nazi ideology privately, would matter little to the victors. Engineers were complicit. Knowledge was a weapon, and he had forged many weapons. The pilot asked me something, Hans continued. He asked why German pilots fought so fanatically even now, when the war was clearly lost. Why we didn't just surrender and spare ourselves. What did you say? I had no answer. Because I don't understand it myself anymore. Loyalty? Fear? Habit? Once you've committed to a path, even when you know it leads to destruction, it's easier to keep walking than to admit you were wrong from the beginning. They stood in silence, watching the last light fade from the western sky. Somewhere beyond that horizon was America, untouched by war, its factories running 3 shifts, its citizens living in comfort that was unimaginable here. The asymmetry was total. Paul approached, his face troubled. "Dr. Eisen, you should see this." They followed him into the hangar, where he had been examining the Mustang's ammunition boxes. He had opened one of the 50 caliber ammunition containers and laid out several rounds on a workbench. "Look at the manufacturing dates," Paul said. Karl examined the brass casings. Each round was stamped with a production date, December 1944, barely 2 months old. The ammunition was fresh from American factories, representing production so recent that it boggled the mind. "They're making millions of rounds," Paul said. Millions. And not just ammunition aircraft. Tanks, trucks, ships, everything. An entire continent devoted to war production, and they're not even being bombed. Karl picked up one of the rounds, feeling its weight. It was perfectly manufactured, each dimension exact, each component fitted with precision. This single bullet represented a supply chain that stretched from copper mines to brass mills to ammunition factories to transport ships to air bases in England, all operating with clockwork efficiency. Germany's ammunition production, by contrast, was increasingly reliant on slave labor in underground factories, using degraded materials, producing rounds of inconsistent quality. Karl had seen reports of gun jams and misfires becoming increasingly common. "When I was young," Karl said quietly, "I believed German engineering was the finest in the world, that our scientific tradition, our technical universities, our culture of precision and excellence made us superior. And in many ways, we were superior. Individual German craftsmen and engineers were extraordinary. But," Hans prompted, "but we forgot that engineering is not just about individual brilliance. It's about systems, about collaboration, about creating frameworks where good people can do excellent work consistently." America understood this. They built not just good aircraft, but a good system for building aircraft. And systems defeat individuals every time. Franz had been listening from the doorway. "Will you include that in your report?" "I'll include the truth," Karl said. "Whether anyone listens is beyond my control." That night, Karl worked late, expanding his technical analysis into something broader, a meditation on engineering philosophy, on the relationship between technology and society, on what Germany had lost when it embraced ideology over evidence. He knew the report would likely be buried, dismissed as defeatist or ignored in the chaos of collapse. But he wrote it anyway, driven by a need to document not just what had happened, but why. To create a record that might survive, even if he did not. At 3 in the morning, exhausted, he finally set down his pen. The report was as complete as he could make it. 70 pages of technical analysis, philosophical reflection, and brutal honesty about German failures. He sealed it in an envelope and addressed copies to 3 different recipients. One to the Air Ministry as required, one to his old professor at the Technical University of Berlin, and one to his wife with instructions to hide it and protect it no matter what came. If he was going to die, and death seemed increasingly certain, at least his knowledge might survive him. Outside, the first snow of a new storm began to fall, covering the frozen airfield in fresh white, erasing the traces of their work as if it had never happened. The 5th day brought a breakthrough in understanding that was as much philosophical as technical. Karl had been studying the Mustang's wing construction, specifically the laminar flow airfoil design that gave the aircraft its exceptional performance at high speeds. Laminar flow was a theoretical ideal, smooth, uninterrupted airflow over the wing surface that minimized drag. German aerodynamicists had understood the theory for years, but implementing it in practice had proven elusive. The laminar flow airfoil required extremely smooth surfaces and precise contours. Even minor manufacturing imperfections would disrupt the flow, negating the benefits. Yet here it was, achieved not in a laboratory or a hand-built prototype, but in a mass-produced aircraft rolling off assembly lines by the hundreds. "How?" Karl asked aloud, examining the wing surface with a magnifying glass. How did they maintain this surface quality in large-scale production? Dr. Brandt, who had returned for a second visit without the Gestapo escort, peered over Karl's shoulder. "Superior quality control, perhaps?" No, Karl said slowly. Realization dawning. Superior production philosophy. Look, they didn't try to hand-finish each wing to perfection. They created tooling and processes that delivered consistent results. They accepted that mass production would yield slightly less optimal performance than handcrafted components, but that the consistency and quantity would more than compensate. It was the same principle he had observed in the engine, in the aluminum construction, in every aspect of the aircraft. The Americans had optimized for reproducibility, rather than absolute perfection. But surely German precision should allow us to achieve the same or better results, Brandt asked. Karl set down his magnifying glass and removed his glasses, rubbing his tired eyes. German precision is individual, not systematic. A master craftsman at Messerschmitt can produce an airfoil of extraordinary quality. But can we produce 10,000 identical airfoils of the same quality? Can we do it quickly, with workers of varying skill levels, in factories under bombardment? No, we cannot. Hans, who had been listening while reviewing pilot reports from recent engagements, added his perspective. It's not just the machines. It's the pilots, too. American fighter pilots are competent but rarely exceptional. Yet they win because there are so many of them, because they can afford to lose aircraft and pilots and still maintain numerical superiority. We train aces, invest years in developing individual excellence. They train adequate pilots in months and send them in such numbers that individual skill becomes irrelevant. Quantity has a quality all its own, Karl murmured, quoting Stalin without irony. We dismissed that as Soviet barbarism, waves of untrained men throwing themselves against German skill. But the Americans have achieved the same numerical advantage while maintaining technical quality. That combination is unbeatable. Brandt walked around the aircraft, taking in its entirety. So what is the lesson? That Germany should abandon our tradition of excellence? Embrace mediocrity? No, Karl said firmly. The lesson is that excellence must be embedded in systems, not individuals. That true mastery lies not in creating one perfect object, but in creating a process that reliably produces very good objects. The Americans haven't abandoned quality, they've democratized it. It was a radical thought, especially in a society that had elevated hierarchy, specialization, and elite expertise to ideological principles. Nazi philosophy celebrated the Führerprinzip, the leadership principle where authority and excellence flowed downward from great individuals. But modern industrial warfare required the opposite, competence distributed throughout the entire system. Paul approached with another discovery. He had been examining the Mustang's control surfaces and had found something interesting in the aileron construction. Sir, look at this. The aileron was lighter than equivalent German designs, but equally strong. The secret lay in the internal structure, a honeycomb framework that provided rigidity while minimizing weight. It was elegant and efficient. But more importantly, it was reproducible. The honeycomb structure could be stamped out by machines and assembled by workers with minimal training. See? Karl said to Brandt. Innovation in service of production. They didn't design the best possible aileron. They designed the best aileron that could be mass-produced reliably. Brandt made notes, but Karl could see doubt in his eyes. Men of their generation, trained in German technical universities where professors lectured on the supremacy of German engineering, found it difficult to accept that their fundamental assumptions might be wrong. The war is over, Karl said bluntly. Not officially. Perhaps not for months yet, but it's over. The question is what we do with this knowledge afterward. Do we cling to old methods and old philosophies? Or do we learn from those who defeated us? That sounds dangerously close to admiring the enemy, Brandt said carefully. I admire competence wherever I find it. And I mourn the waste of having our competence destroyed by ideology that valued loyalty over merit, purity over pragmatism. Hans stood abruptly. Enough philosophy. The Soviets are 40 kilometers away. We need to decide what to do with this aircraft and our findings. He was right. The political discussions were luxury they could no longer afford. Within days, perhaps hours. This facility would be overrun. They needed to make decisions. "We photograph everything," Karl said. "Complete documentation. Multiple copies distributed through different channels. We disassemble key components, the engine, the supercharger assembly, the radio equipment, and transport them west ahead of the Soviet advance. And we destroy what we cannot take, so it doesn't fall into Soviet hands intact. The party will object to destroying captured enemy equipment," Franz warned. "The party is collapsing. By the time they could object, we'll either be dead or in Soviet captivity anyway." They worked through the night, photographing every component, every measurement, every technical detail. Paul and the other mechanics carefully packaged the engine and other valuable components for transport. Hans coordinated with the facility commander to arrange trucks and passage west through the crumbling German lines. As dawn broke on the 6th day, Karl stood before the Mustang one final time. Tomorrow they would burn what remained, erasing this particular aircraft from existence while preserving its secrets in documents and photographs scattered to the winds. "I wish I could meet the engineers who designed this," he said to no one in particular. "Share a drink with them, discuss our respective approaches, learn from each other as colleagues rather than enemies." "Perhaps you will," Hans said, joining him. "If we survive. If the world that comes after this war has room for such things." "The world that comes after," Karl repeated. "What world will that be? We're about to be occupied, divided. Our industry dismantled. Our science controlled by victors who have every reason to fear German technical capability. Then perhaps it will be a better world. One where technical capability serves human flourishing, rather than conquest and genocide." Karl glanced at Hans, surprised by the bitter edge in his friend's voice. Hans rarely spoke of politics, maintaining the professional soldier's fiction of political neutrality. But the mask was cracking now, revealing the disillusionment beneath. "You know what the Americans found when they liberated the camps," Hans continued. "The reports are filtering through, even though the party tries to suppress them. Everything we did, everything we told ourselves was necessary, justified, patriotic. It was all in service of that. Of systematic murder on an industrial scale. We didn't know. We chose not to know. There's a difference. And now this aircraft, this beautiful, terrible machine, sits here as evidence of what happens when a nation applies its industrial genius to human purposes rather than inhuman ones. They built this to defeat us. And thank God they did, because we deserve to be defeated." The words hung in the cold air. Franz, overhearing, looked frightened. Such sentiments were treasonous, suicidal to voice aloud. But who was left to inform on them? The Reich was dying, and the living were concerned only with survival. Karl placed his hand on the Mustang's propeller, feeling the cold metal, the bent blades that had spun at 3,000 RPM carrying this aircraft and its pilot across hostile skies. "We lost more than a war," he said quietly. "We lost our way. Let's hope we, or whoever comes after us, can find it again." The Soviet advance accelerated. By the 7th day, refugees were streaming west past the airfield in an endless, desperate column. Karl saw faces gray with exhaustion and fear, old men, women, children, all fleeing before the Red Army. The facility commander, Major Otto Schneider, gathered Karl's team. "Gentlemen, we evacuate tomorrow at dawn. The transport trucks have been allocated. You have 24 hours to complete your work." It was barely enough time, but it would have to suffice. Karl divided his team. Paul and 2 mechanics would finalize the engine crating and prepare it for transport. Hans would organize the documentation and ensure multiple copies were distributed through different channels. Franz would coordinate with Schneider for the logistics of their departure. Karl himself would conduct one final analysis, a comprehensive flight performance calculation based on all their measurements and observations. He worked through the day and into the evening, filling pages with calculations, wing loading, power-to-weight ratios, drag coefficients, fuel consumption rates. He compared every parameter to equivalent German fighters, the Bf-109G, the Fw-190D, even the revolutionary Me-262 jet. The results confirmed what he had already known intuitively. The P-51D was not superior in every individual category, but its combination of range, performance, and reliability created a package that was unbeatable in practice. It could escort bombers all the way to Berlin, fight for an hour over the target, and still return home. No German fighter could match that capability, but more revealing were the production figures. Hans had obtained intelligence estimates through his contacts. North American Aviation was producing over 400 Mustangs per month. 400. Every 30 days, more P-51 seconds rolled off American assembly lines than the Luftwaffe had operational fighters of all types. Karl sat back, overwhelmed by the mathematics of it. Even if German pilots shot down every enemy aircraft they encountered an impossible standard, they would still lose through attrition. The Americans could afford to trade losses 10-1 and still achieve air superiority through sheer numbers. The war was over before it began, he muttered to himself. We just didn't realize it. A commotion outside drew him from his calculations. He emerged from the office to find Sturmbannführer Kraus had returned, this time with a squad of SS troops. Dr. Eisen, Kraus said coldly, you are under arrest for defeatist propaganda and possible collaboration with the enemy. Karl felt his blood freeze, but he kept his voice steady. On what evidence? Your report contains passages that could undermine German morale and fighting spirit. You have made unauthorized contact with enemy prisoners. Your loyalty to the Reich is in question. Hans stepped forward. This is absurd. Dr. Eisen has served the Luftwaffe faithfully for 15 years. His technical assessment is exactly what was requested. The technical assessment is acceptable. His political commentary is not. He will be transported to Berlin for interrogation. Everyone knew what that meant. Berlin was chaos. The government apparatus collapsing. Interrogation in the current climate was likely a death sentence, a bullet in the back of the head in some rubble-strewn cellar. Major Schneider intervened. Sturmbannführer, forgive me, but we are evacuating this facility tomorrow. I cannot spare men or vehicles for prisoner transport. Soviet forces are less than a day behind us. Then he will be detained here and left for the Soviets. That would be a waste of valuable technical expertise, Schneider said carefully. Dr. Eisen's knowledge will be needed to support the Luftwaffe's continued operations. What continued operations? Karl thought bitterly. But Schneider was trying to save his life, and he was grateful. Kraus hesitated, calculating. He was a political officer, yes, but not a fool. The Red Army was coming, and his own survival depended on retreating west. He couldn't afford to be delayed over one engineer's arrest. Very well, Kraus said finally. But Dr. Eisen's movements will be restricted. He reports daily to the nearest party office during the evacuation. It was a face-saving compromise. Kraus could claim he had taken action while avoiding the practical difficulties of actually arresting anyone during a chaotic retreat. After Kraus departed, Schneider drew Karl aside. You need to leave tonight. Before he changes his mind or sends someone else to arrest you. I can't abandon my work. Your work is meaningless if you're dead. Hans has copies of everything important. The engine is crated and ready for transport. You need to vanish into the refugee columns and make your way west. Karl wanted to argue, but he knew Schneider was right. His presence had become a liability. If he was arrested, his research might be confiscated or destroyed. But if he disappeared into the chaos of retreat, he might survive to share his knowledge after the war. That evening, he said his goodbyes. Paul gave him a Wehrmacht greatcoat to replace his Luftwaffe uniform, better camouflage among civilians. Hans pressed documents into his hands, travel papers, identification, letters of introduction, all carefully forged. If you make it to the American lines, Hans said quietly, tell them there were Germans who knew, who understood, who hoped you would win. Karl embraced his friend, uncertain if they would ever meet again. What will you do? Stay with the unit until the end. Then surrender to the Americans if I can, the British if I must. Anything but the Soviets. Franz shook Karl's hand formally. Your research will survive, Doctor. I'll make certain of that. Thank you, Lieutenant. And I'm sorry. Sorry that your generation was wasted on this war, on the Reich's ambitions. Franz looked away. We were taught to believe. We didn't know, or we didn't want to know, what we were believing in. That's our burden to carry. As darkness fell, Karl slipped out of the facility and joined the refugee column heading west. He carried a small suitcase containing his essential documents, a change of clothes, and one photograph of the P-51 Mustang. The road was chaos, military vehicles trying to push through crowds of civilians, everyone moving west away from the approaching Soviet army. Karl walked for hours, just another anonymous figure in a greatcoat, indistinguishable from thousands of others fleeing the collapse. Behind him, he heard the explosions as the facility was destroyed to prevent its capture. He hoped the Mustang burned completely, its secrets preserved only in the documents and photographs scattered westward like seeds on the wind. The night was cold, and the road was long, but Karl kept walking, one foot in front of the other, carrying with him the knowledge of what he had learned, and the hope that somehow, somewhere, it might matter. 3 years after the war ended, Karl stood in a California factory, watching P-51 Mustangs being built. He was there as part of Operation Paperclip, the American program that recruited German scientists and engineers to work for the United States. It was a controversial program. Many Americans objected to employing men who had served the Nazi regime, but the Cold War had begun, and technical expertise trumped moral qualms. Karl's contribution was in aerospace engineering, applying lessons learned from his wartime research to America's growing aviation industry. He worked alongside former enemies who had become colleagues, sharing knowledge and techniques in ways that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. The North American aviation factory floor stretched before him, a cathedral of industry. Assembly lines moved with mechanical precision. Workers, men and women of every background, performed their specialized tasks with practiced efficiency. Components arrived from suppliers across the country, each one manufactured to exact specifications, each one fitting perfectly into the larger whole. An American engineer named Robert Chen, whose parents had immigrated from China, gave Karl the tour. "We're transitioning away from wartime production," Robert explained. "These are the last Mustangs we'll build. The future is jets." Karl nodded. He had worked on jet propulsion systems himself during the war. The Me-262 had been operational before any Allied jet fighter. But the Germans had been years ahead in jet technology, yet still lost the war. Technology alone was never enough. "I studied the reports you wrote," Robert said. "The analysis of the captured Mustang. Very thorough. What did you think when you first saw it?" Karl considered his answer carefully. "I thought that we had been fools, that we had told ourselves we were superior when we were merely different, that we had confused individual brilliance with systematic excellence." Robert smiled. "We have our own problems, you know. Racism, inequality, all kinds of injustice. We're not perfect. No society is. But you built a system that could absorb contributions from everyone regardless of origin. German scientists, Chinese engineers, women in factory jobs. You made competence matter more than pedigree. That's what we failed to do." They walked through the factory, and Karl found himself thinking of Paul, Hans, Franz, wondering what had become of them. Hans had survived the war and was living in Hamburg, working as a commercial pilot. Franz had been killed in the final days of fighting. Paul had simply disappeared into the chaos of defeat, his fate unknown. Before leaving Germany, Karl had managed to retrieve the documents he'd sent to his wife. She and their daughter had survived the war, though their home in Hamburg had been destroyed by bombing. They were building a new life in America now, trying to forget the past while carrying its lessons forward. In Karl's office at the aviation company, he kept one memento from that frozen airfield in 1945. The photograph of the P-51 Mustang, twisted in the snow. He looked at it sometimes and remembered what he had learned. The photograph was not a memorial to defeat, but a reminder of humility. It represented the moment when comfortable certainties had been stripped away, when he had been forced to confront the gap between what he believed and what was true. Years later, when his grandson asked him about the war, Karl would take down that photograph and tell the story. Not a story of heroes and villains, those narratives were too simple, but a story about systems and philosophies, about the difference between individual excellence and collective achievement. The Mustang taught me that true strength comes from building systems where good people can do excellent work consistently, he would say. Not from trying to create a few perfect individuals who can work miracles. It was a lesson that applied to more than engineering. It applied to societies, to cultures, to the entire architecture of how humans organize themselves to solve problems and create value. The P-51 Mustang had been more than an aircraft. It had been a message from one civilization to another, written in aluminum and steel, powered by petroleum and precision. The message was simple. Openness defeats closed thinking. Collaboration defeats hierarchy. Systems defeat individuals. Karl never forgot that message. And in the decades that followed, working in American aerospace, contributing to the space program, teaching at universities, he tried to pass it on to new generations of engineers who would face challenges he couldn't imagine. The frozen airfield was gone now, erased by time and reconstruction. The Third Reich had collapsed into history, its ambitions reduced to rubble and cautionary tales. But the lessons endured, preserved in the memories of those who had lived through the catastrophe and emerged with wisdom purchased at terrible cost. On his last day at North American Aviation before retirement, Karl stood on the factory floor one final time. The assembly lines were silent now. The last P-51 had been built years ago, and the factory had moved on to other aircraft. But he could still hear the echo of that first Mustang's engine starting in the frozen hangar, could still feel the vibration through his boots, could still remember the moment when he understood that everything he had believed was wrong. It wasn't just a machine, it was a message from the future. And the future, as it turned out, belonged to those who could learn from anyone, anywhere, who could subordinate pride to pragmatism, ideology to evidence, tradition to innovation. Karl placed his hand on a workbench, feeling the solid reality of American industrial might. Then he turned and walked out into California sunshine, an old man carrying secrets that were no longer secret, a former enemy who had become something more complicated, a witness to transformation, a translator between worlds, a reminder that wisdom can come from defeat if we're humble enough to accept it. The sky, which had once belonged to nations, now belonged to the future. And the future, Karl knew, would be built by those who remembered the lessons written in aluminum and steel on a frozen airfield in the final winter of a war that changed everything.